Dean Ashford had been sitting at the counter of the Bridgewater Diner for 20 minutes, telling his riding partner it was 31 years to the day since he'd buried a daughter he never got to hold, when a homeless woman 2 tables over set down her coffee cup, crossed the diner floor on legs that clearly cost her something to trust, and gripped his sleeve hard enough that he turned around before she'd said a single word. "Your daughter isn't dead," Irene Colby whispered. Dean Ashford had spent 31 years building a life around the opposite of that sentence. What he found out over the following 6 weeks, because a homeless woman he had never met decided, in the last stretch of her own life, that she could not carry a secret into her grave any longer, was not something he had let himself hope for since he was 23 years old. Dean was 54, a Hell's Angel for 28 years, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent 3 decades using his body to outrun something his mind never fully managed to leave behind. He had loved a girl named Carol Renner when he was 19, the daughter of one of Bridgewater's wealthier families, a relationship her father had made his disapproval of clear from the first time Dean showed up at their door on a motorcycle instead of in a car that met with Harlan Renner's approval. Carol's house had gone quiet whenever Dean visited, the specific silence of a family deciding, collectively and without discussion, to wait him out rather than confront him directly. Carol got pregnant at 20. Her father sent her to stay with an aunt in another state for the last 4 months of the pregnancy, ostensibly to avoid local gossip. And Dean, 23 by then, and working construction to try to prove himself worth taking seriously, had been told, 3 days after the baby was born, that his daughter had died of complications during delivery. He had never seen a body. He had been told by a doctor he never met in person and a message relayed through Harlan Renner himself that the family had already handled arrangements, that there was nothing left for Dean to see or sign or bury himself. He had built a small memorial in the corner of the Bridgewater Cemetery instead, a stone with a name and 2 dates 11 days apart, because a man needs somewhere to stand on the anniversary of a loss, even when he was never given the chance to attend an actual funeral. He had chosen the name himself, guessing at what Carol might have wanted, since even that detail had been withheld from him in the chaos of those first grief-stricken weeks. Carol had never fully recovered from what she believed, until her own death 9 years ago was the loss of both her daughter and, not long after, Dean himself, Harlan Renner having made it clear that a relationship built on that kind of grief was not one he intended to let continue. And Carol, 20 years old and devastated and entirely under her father's financial control, had not had the strength left to fight him on both fronts at once. She married someone her father approved of 4 years later, a marriage that lasted a decade and produced no other children, and died of ovarian cancer at 49, having spent nearly 3 decades believing a lie neither she nor Dean had ever had reason to question. Dean rode to that small cemetery stone every year on the anniversary, rain or shine, missing the ritual only twice in 31 years. Once for a broken collarbone, once for a chapter emergency that could not wait. It had become, over the decades, less a single day of grief and more a kind of anchor point, a reminder to himself that the worst thing that had ever happened to him had not, in fact, managed to end him. He had done it for 31 years, a ritual so consistent that his riding partner that day, a man named Walt, who'd known him for a decade, had only mentioned the date out loud, because Dean seemed, this particular year, to be carrying it heavier than usual. Before we get to what Irene Colby told him next, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe so this story doesn't get lost in the feed, and drop your city or state down in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more than you'd guess to see how far a story like this can travel. Now, back to the counter at the Bridgewater Diner, because what this homeless woman was about to tell Dean Ashford was about to unravel 31 years of grief, built on a foundation that had never actually been true. Irene Colby was 79 years old and had been a labor and delivery nurse at Bridgewater General for 11 years before her license was suspended over an unrelated documentation error that, looking back, she suspected had been the universe delivering a consequence to the wrong incident at the right time. She had been homeless for 6 years, ever since the small pension her suspension had cost her ran out, and a lifetime of quiet drinking finally cost her the apartment that came with it. She had been diagnosed 4 months earlier with a cancer aggressive enough that the free clinic doctor had stopped using the word if when discussing her timeline and started using the word when. She spent most nights now at a shelter 2 blocks from the diner, where the dormitory went silent by 9 most evenings. The specific silence of a room full of people who had each, in their own way, run out of better places to be. She had started, in the last few months, keeping a small notebook of things she wanted to make right before she ran out of time to make any of them right at all. Dean Ashford's name had been at the top of that list for longer than she had let herself admit. Even to herself. 31 years ago, Irene had been a 28-year-old nurse working the delivery ward the night Carol Renner gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She had also been, that same year, 3 months behind on rent for the first time in her adult life, a fact Harlan Renner's assistant had apparently researched thoroughly before approaching her with an arrangement. The arrangement had been simple and had haunted Irene for 3 decades regardless. Harlan Renner did not want his daughter raising a child with a man he considered beneath the family's standing. He had arranged, quietly, through connections Irene never fully understood, for the newborn to be placed with a family 2 states away. A private, informal adoption handled entirely outside any system that might have required Dean's consent, or even his knowledge that consent was something he should have been asked for. Irene's role had been small and, at the time, felt survivable. Falsify the paperwork that told both young parents, separately, that the baby had not survived. She had been paid enough to clear her overdue rent for a full year, a sum that had felt, at 28 and desperate, like the difference between keeping a roof and losing one. She had told herself, for years, that she had saved a baby from a fight 2 grieving 20-year-olds were poorly equipped to win regardless. She had told herself that the family who received the child were kind people who wanted a baby badly enough to pay generously for the chance. She had told herself a great many things that had, over 3 decades, curdled into the specific guilt that eventually cost her a license, a marriage, and most of the life she might otherwise have built. Her ex-husband, she would say later, had left less because of the drinking itself, and more because he had never understood what she was drinking to forget, and she had never found the courage to tell him. She had recognized Dean Ashford around town for years without ever working up the nerve to approach him. She had recognized the memorial stone's dates, once, driving past the cemetery with someone else's car on someone else's errand, and had known immediately, with the sick certainty of a person confirming their worst private fear, exactly whose grief that stone represented. She had gone home that night and not slept at all, turning the notebook page for Dean's name over in her hands until the sun came up. It was the diagnosis that finally moved her. A person does not get many more chances to fix something once a doctor stops saying if. Her name is Nora, Irene said, once Dean had gotten her seated, gotten her water, and gotten his own breathing back under something resembling control. The family that took her renamed her, obviously, but that's what your Carol wanted to call her. And I remember it because it felt like the least I could do, making sure I got that detail right before I lied about everything else. Dean's hands, wrapped around a coffee cup he had stopped drinking from the moment Irene sat down, had gone entirely still, the specific stillness of a man whose whole body was holding its breath at once. He froze in that stillness for a long moment. Unable to make his mouth form the question his entire chest was demanding, he asked. "You're telling me my daughter's alive," Dean said, his voice trembling despite every effort to hold it steady. 31 years, and you're telling me now, in a diner, over coffee. "I know there's no version of this that doesn't sound monstrous," Irene said. "I've had 31 years to think of a better way to say it, and I never found one. I'm dying, Mr. Ashford. I didn't want to die having never said it at all." Something in Dean's chest went cold, and then, almost immediately, entirely on fire, grief and fury, and a hope. He had spent 3 decades refusing to let himself feel all arriving at once, with nowhere adequate to land. Whatever composure he had walked into that diner with broke completely. And he had to set the coffee cup down before his own trembling hand spilled it across the counter. "Where?" Dean said. It was not a question so much as the only word he trusted himself to say without his voice breaking entirely. Irene told him what she remembered. A family named Fenwick, 2 states over. A private attorney who had since passed away. The vague shape of a paper trail that had been deliberately built to be difficult to follow. It was not much. It was, after 31 years of nothing at all, considerably more than Dean had ever expected to have again. He called his chapter president that same night, the same way he had called about nothing else in 28 years of writing, and told a story that took considerably longer to get through than he expected, given how many times he had to stop. "You believe her?" his president asked, once Dean had finished. "Don't know yet," Dean said. "No, I can't afford not to find out. Word inside a brotherhood does not move the way word moves anywhere else." Within 2 days, a member who worked in records research for the county had located an old adoption filing under the Fenwick name, decades out of date, but real, pointing to a town 3 states over. Within a week, another member with a private investigator's license had confirmed a Nora Fenwick, 31 years old, living and working as a veterinarian in that same town, raised by a family who had, as far as anyone could tell from the outside, loved her without complication for her entire life. The investigator, a former state trooper named Ruiz, spent an extra unpaid day making certain of that last detail specifically, telling Dean afterward that he'd wanted to be sure Dean wasn't about to walk into a life that had actually gone badly, rather than one that had gone on without him. Dean did not show up at her door unannounced. 11 members of his chapter spent most of a week helping him think through a better approach, understanding that a woman with a stable, happy life did not necessarily want a stranger's 54-year-old grief arriving on her doorstep uninvited, however true it turned out to be. They helped him write a letter instead, careful, honest, offering a DNA test before anything else, making clear he wanted nothing from her except the chance to know whether the story was true, and asking for nothing beyond what she felt able to give in return. Dean rewrote that letter 11 times before Walt finally took the pen out of his hand and told him the 9th draft had already said everything that needed saying. Nora Fenwick called the number in that letter 4 days after receiving it. 4 days that Dean spent unable to sleep more than a few hours at a stretch, checking his phone so often that Walt eventually took to hiding it from him for an hour at a time to make him eat a full meal without looking at the screen. The DNA test, arranged through a lab neither of them had to pay full price for, once Walt's cousin, who ran a genetics lab, heard the story, confirmed within 3 weeks what Irene Colby had already known walking across that diner floor. Dean met his daughter for the first time in a parking lot outside her veterinary clinic on a Saturday morning in June. 31 years and 4 months after he'd been told she never existed past her first 3 days of life. He had killed his engine outside the clinic 10 minutes early and sat with it, unable to make himself walk in, until Nora herself came out to see whose motorcycle had been idling in her parking lot for so long. She looked Dean would say later. Like Carol had looked at 20, the same set to her jaw. The same way of tilting her head slightly when she was deciding what to make of someone. Neither of them managed much in the way of words for the first several minutes, standing in a parking lot that neither of them had expected to become the site of something this large. Nora, it turned out, had grown up loved, curious about her biological parents in the ordinary, unhaunted way of adopted children, who were never given reason to suspect anything more complicated than a closed adoption, and had spent the last 3 weeks since Dean's letter arrived doing her own quiet grieving for a version of her history she had never known to mourn before. I always wondered, Nora told him, once they'd both found something like their footing. Not in a way that hurt. I wondered. I wondered every single day for 31 years, Dean said. Different kind of wondering, I think. I'd like to hear about her, Nora said. My mother, the one I never got the chance to know I had. Dean spent the rest of that afternoon telling her everything he could remember about Carol Renner. 28 years dead now himself in every way, but the one that mattered. Finally getting to say a version of it out loud to the one person in the world who had the most right to hear it. He told her about the motorcycle rides Carol used to beg him to take her on before her father found out. He told her about the argument that had ended things between him and Harlan Renner for good, and about the specific sound of Carol's laugh, which he had spent 31 years afraid he would eventually forget, and had not, in fact, forgotten at all. Irene Colby died 11 weeks later, in a hospice bed the club had quietly arranged and paid for once they learned the state of her finances, with Dean sitting beside her more days than not, despite every reasonable justification he might have had for staying angry at her instead. He had decided, somewhere in those 11 weeks, that a woman who spent 31 years carrying a guilt heavy enough to cost her everything, and who had used what little time she had left to finally set it down honestly, had earned something other than his anger by the end of it. He brought Nora to visit twice, watching 2 women who would never have known each other's names sit together in a small hospice room, one of them apologizing in ways she never found the right words for in the other, gently telling her she didn't need to keep trying. Thank you, Irene whispered to him, the last time he visited, 3 days before she died, for not making me carry it alone at the end. You gave me my daughter back, Dean said. Whatever this is, it's not even close to even. Dean and Nora see each other most months now, the distance between their towns shrinking a little more each visit as both of them find their footing in a relationship neither had expected to need to build from scratch at their respective ages. She has met the club. The club, by unanimous and largely unnecessary vote, has adopted her the way a brotherhood adopts anyone connected closely enough to one of its own. A fact Nora finds equal parts overwhelming and, increasingly, something she looks forward to each time she visits. She has taken, in the last few months, to bringing a bag of dog treats to chapter cookouts, on the theory that a veterinarian ought to have something useful to contribute besides conversation. Dean still rides to that cemetery stone every year on the anniversary, though these days he brings Nora with him when her schedule allows it, and the visit has become less about grief and more about the specific, complicated gratitude of 2 people who found each other decades later than they should have, and are trying, one visit at a time, to make up for lost time neither of them chose to lose in the first place. Nora has started leaving a small stone from her own town on the memorial each visit, a quiet ritual of her own that she has never fully explained and Dean has never asked her to. If this story reached you, if you believe the truth is worth telling even decades late, even at real personal cost to the person finally telling it, share it with someone who needs the reminder that it is never too late to set down a burden honestly. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and whether you believe a person can ever fully make amends for something like this. And if you believe Dean and Nora deserve to find each other after 31 years apart, type reunited below so they know it reached you too.